Chapter 19 of Against Odds by Lawrence L. Lynch. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Chapter 19. Strange! Mistaken! Heartless! I was not disappointed in my interview with the uptown jeweller, who, being as real as the World's Fair itself, must not be named. In order to identify the jewel offered by the strange woman, I took Monsieur Lausch with me, and he at once declared the description of the emerald to correspond precisely with the one stolen from him, and when I had listened to the description of the woman who had offered the gem, I was quite as confident that this person was the brunette and no other. True, she had assumed a foreign accent, and had laid aside her rather jaunty dress for a more sober and foreign-looking attire. She had made herself up, in fact, as a German woman, well dressed after the fashion of the German bourgeois, but she had added nothing to her face save a pair of gold-framed spectacles, and while I kept my knowledge to myself, I felt none the less sure that I had another link ready for the chain I was trying to forge for this troublesome brunette, who was so busy casting her shadows across my path and disarranging my plans. The writer of the anonymous letter, for such it was, turned out to be a practical jeweller in the employ of a certain jewel merchant, and I never knew whether he had made his employer's purchase known to us for the sake of the reward, or to gratify some personal spite or sense of injury. Whichever it may have been, it concerned us little. We gave him our word not to use his name in approaching his employer, and our promise of a suitable reward should we find his story of use upon further investigation, and then we sought the purchaser of the jewel. With him we dealt very cavalierly. We knew, no matter how, that he had purchased an emerald of value, we told him, and I further added that he had bought it from an accomplice, knowing that such an accusation would soonest bring about the desired result, as indeed it did. A sight of the jewel sent Monsieur Lausch into raptures and rages. It was the lost emerald, the finest of them all. That he could not at once carry away the gem somewhat modified his rapture, but we came away quite satisfied on the whole, he that the emerald would soon be restored to him, and I that I at last knew how to deal with the brunette, always provided I should find her again after the events of the day and night previous. On the second day after his plunge into the lagoon, I took Miss Jenrys and her aunt to see the injured guard, who was booked at the hospital as Carr. The blow upon the head had resulted first in unconsciousness, and later in a mild form of delirium. I had made a preparatory visit to the hospital, and was able to tell Miss Jenrys that the patient would not recognise her or any of us. I thought that she seemed almost relieved at this intelligence, especially after I had assured her that the surgeon in charge had assured me that the delirium was much to be preferred as a less dangerous symptom than the lethargy of the first 24 hours. "Mr. Masters," she had said to me on our way to the hospital, "there is one thing which I overlooked in telling you what I could about Mr. Lossing. I trust you have not told them at the hospital, or anywhere, that he is not what he represented himself." I hastened to assure her that this secret rested still between us two, and she drew a quick breath of relief. "If he should die," I added, watching furtively the sudden paling of her fair cheek, "it would become my duty and yours to tell the truth, all of it. As he seems likely to recover, we may safely let the disclosure rest with him." "I am glad," she said. "So long as he chooses to be Mr. Carr, I cannot, of course, claim his acquaintance. You are sure he will not know me?" "Quite sure," I replied, and she said no more until we reached the hospital. We were asked to wait for a few moments in the outer office or reception room. The doctor was occupied for the moment, the attendant said, but an instant later the same attendant beckoned me outside. "Come this way a moment," he whispered. "The doctor wishes to speak with you." I murmured an excuse to the ladies, and went to the doctor in his little private room near by. "When you were here," he began, putting out his hand to me, "I was preoccupied and you were in haste. There is something concerning our patient that you, as his friend, must know. By the way, has he any nearer friends than yourself at hand?" "I believe not," I replied briefly. "I hope he is not worse, doctor." "No, not that, though he's bad enough. But you remember the sailors who came with you said that he had struck against the boat in falling, and we decided, rather hastily, that this was the cause of the wound and swelling. In fact, it was the swelling which misled us. We could not examine closely until it was somewhat reduced. But this morning, after the wound was washed and cleansed for the new dressing, I found that the hurt upon his head was caused, not by contact with a blunt piece of wood, but by something hard, sharp, and somewhat uneven of surface, a stone, I should say, or a piece of old iron. A blow, in fact." "Ah!" The sudden thought that came to me caused me to start, but after a moment I said, "I do not doubt it. The fellows that made the attack are equal to worse things than that. I think, from what I know and guess, the weapon may have been a sling of stones or bits of iron tied in an old bandana." I did not tell him that this was said to be one of Greenback Bob's favourite modes of attack, and of defence, too, when otherwise unarmed. In fact, I said nothing to further indicate my knowledge of the assailants of our patient. But I got back to the ladies at once, after thanking the doctor, telling myself that his information would make the charge against the miscreants, when captured, stronger and more serious, if that were needful. When Miss Jenrys stood by the cot where the injured man lay, pallid and weak, with great dark lines beneath his eyes, and his head swathed in bandages, I saw her start and shiver, and the slight colour in an already unusually pale face fade out, leaving her cheek as white as that upon the pillow. The small hand clenched itself until the dainty glove was drawn to the point of bursting. The lips trembled, and the tears stood in the sweet eyes. She turned to the physician and drew back a little as the head upon the pillow moved restlessly. I have not seen him for some time. Do you think it could possibly startle him if he should recognize me? If it were possible, which I fear it is not now, there is nothing that would benefit him so much." She went close to the cot then, and, bending down, looked into the restless blue eyes. "How do you do?" she said clearly. The restless eyes were still for a moment, then the head upon the pillow moved as if essaying a bow, and the right hand was feebly lifted. She took his hand as if in greeting, and said again, speaking softly and clearly, "Won't you go and speak with my Aunt Charlotte?" A startled look came into the eyes, a look of distress crossed the face. He made a feeble gesture with the right hand, a great sigh escaped his lips, and then they parted. "Strange!" they muttered feebly. "Cruel! Mistaken! Heartless!" His hand dropped heavily, and, quick as thought, Miss Jenrys lifted her head and drew back, her face one rosy glow from temples to chin. And now the sweet Quakeress interposed with womanly tact. "He does not know thee, dear, and perhaps our presence may disturb him in his weakened state." She bent over the sick man for a moment, scanned the pale, handsome features closely, gently put back a stray lock of hair that had escaped from beneath the bandage and lay across the white full temple. Then she turned to the doctor. "In the absence of nearer friends, doctor, we will stand in their stead. Will you give him your best care, and let nothing be lacking? When we can serve him in any manner, thee will inform us through Mr. Masters, I trust, and, with your permission, I will call to ask after him each day until he is better." Sweet soul! How plain to me was the whole tender little episode! I could imagine June Jenrys telling the story of her rupture with young Lossing as frankly as she had written it to her friend Hilda O'Neil, and more explicitly, with fuller detail. I could fancy the sweet sympathy and tender admonitions of the elder woman, and here, before me, was the visible proof of how she had interpreted the heart of the girl, at once so proud, so honest, and so fearless in an emergency like this. Had the sweet little Quakeress come to the bedside of this suffering young stranger because he was a fellow being, friendless, alone, and in need of help and kindly care, or had she come because she believed that June Jenrys possessed a heart whose monitions might be trusted, and that the man she had singled out from among many as the one man in the world must be a man indeed? Be this as it would, and whatever the frame of mind in which she approached that white cot at her niece's side, I knew, by the lingering touch upon the pale forehead, the deft, gentle, and quite unconscious soothing of the white counterpane across his breast, that the pale, unknowing face had won its way, and that what she took away from that hospital ward was not the tenderly carried burden of another interest and another's anxiety, but a personal interest and a personal liking that could be trusted to sustain itself and grow apace in that tender woman's heart. We were a very silent party as we came away from the hospital. June Jenrys looked as if the word heartless were yet sounding in her ears. I was assuring myself that it was best not to speak of what the surgeon had told me, and the little Quakeress was evidently quite lost to herself in her thoughts of and for others. As I took my leave of them, Miss Ross put out her hand, and after thanking me for my escort, said, "I will not trouble thee to accompany me to–morrow. I know the way perfectly, and can go very well by myself. Indeed, I prefer to do so. I shall not even let June here accompany me at first." Chapter 20